spiritually enriching to those who follow us. So we join them as we pour thanksgiving from our hearts for the great gift of God's redeeming grace. It is our worship in which we join with that heavenly procession. And we go with the saints before the presence of the one who is seated on that throne. And we do so boldly and with confidence. Here's what the beautiful thing about worship is for me. We are most fully who God created us to be when we are involved and engaged in authentic worship. We were all created for worship. And when we come and worship God, we are as close to being what God created us to be as we will ever be in our lives. Jesus told his followers that God is searching for worshipers. John documents this in the 4th chapter of his gospel, and this is what he writes. These are Jesus' words that he writes down. He says, "But the time is coming, indeed it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way, in spirit and in truth." As we prepare for that ultimate worship in heaven that John describes, I think we find some excellent pointers about how to model our worship now. We remember that our worship is intended not only to prepare us for the future, but it's also meant to encourage us on a daily basis. You know, if we just came to church thinking, okay, I'm preparing for the future, but it's not really going to have an impact on what I do tomorrow, it kind of gets lost. So in addition to preparing for the day in which we gather with the saints around the throne of God, with the angels and the elders, and all we have to do is wear our white robes and wave palm branches and sing praises day and night, our worship has to have some impact on our lives now. The greatest lesson I think that Christians need to learn is that worship is meant to be inclusive. That's sort of a loaded word, and I was reluctant to use it because it means a lot of different things to different people, but I want you to know this is how I'm intending it and how I mean it. The countless multitude that is gathered before the throne of God is made up of worshipers from all tribes and peoples and languages. Everyone is invited to respond to the grace of God and to join in worship, and no one should be prevented from doing that. One of the blights on Christian history for me is when one group of human beings prevents another group from being included in worship. And I think we've all been there, or many of us have. All people have been created in the image of God, and we discover our true worth in our worship of God. The church is made strong and its witness made real when worship is inclusive of everyone who desires to be included in worship of the one true God, who came to us in the person of Jesus Christ and made the greatest sacrifice of love that can ever be imagined. Most of us remember the song that we learned as children, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight. Perhaps the adults in charge should pay a bit more attention to the admonition of children. Why bother? Because too many of God's children are being excluded from worship now, and we all need to practice. So why does the multitude worship? We worship to celebrate our redemption. I can't make it any simpler than that. We worship to celebrate our redemption. If we have not been redeemed, then what do we have to worship? One of the elders explains to the writer of Revelation that the multitude is made up of people who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Those are the people Not perfect people. Those are sinful people. But they are people who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb and have made them white and pure. The blood of the Lamb is what makes their robes spotless and pure, not anything they did themselves. The root cause of our worship is our redemption. If we're not here to celebrate our redemption, I have to ask us why we're here. We worship because God has broken down every single barrier that stands between us and divine righteousness. And He did that through the sacrifice of His Son, Jesus Christ. We have been given that gift of Jesus Christ so that each of us can stand fully erected in righteousness in front of God on that judgment day. The truth is just as important now that we are clothed in righteousness as it will be on Judgment Day. One of my favorite hymns reminds us that we are dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. When our robes have been washed in the blood of the Lamb and are white, we are standing perfectly guilt-free and righteous in the eyes of God. And oh, what a day that will be. Because we have been redeemed, and our redemption demands our gratitude and our worship. We worship now to recognize God's gracious care for us. You know, worship and God's care for His children are very closely connected. As we worship, we're embraced by the one who reigns over everything and has everything under control. Just because our lives are spiraling out of control does not mean that God is not in control. Amen. As we worship, we're embraced by the one who has everything under control, whether we realize it or not. Our worship is a clear statement that in spite of the evil in this world and all that it does to us and all the things that would turn us away from worship, we know without a shadow of a doubt that the one in which we've placed our trust will be faithful to care for us. Even in our world today, when we're touched by hunger and thirst, scorching sun, our God still cares for us. He still ministers to our needs through His Spirit. Yes, there's going to come a day in which all those awful things will not be a part of our lives, and they won't be a distraction from our ceaseless worship. But until then, we rest assured that we don't face the things of this world alone. We don't walk by ourselves. We walk with the Holy Spirit. We talked Wednesday night about how difficult it is to see the hands of Jesus when He's in the water and it's dark and the waves are coming high up on the boat. We step out into that stormy water and we can't see the hands of Jesus out there for us. But you know, just because we can't see Him doesn't mean they're not there. After all, isn't faith our belief in things that are not seen? You know what the writer of Hebrews tells us? If you've seen it, what good is faith? Faith is the belief and assurance of things that are not seen. Worship is meant to strengthen our faith as we're called to step out of the boat into this world of storms. And when we do that, we know that Jesus is in the water waiting for us, even on those days that we can't see Him. All the weapons that Satan uses against us in this world to prevent us from worshiping will one day be forgotten in history. Thank God. Until then, we have to worship knowing that our human tears will cease one day. Not today, but one day. And God's Spirit will be with us as our comforter and our advocate. In spite of our troubles in this life, comfort is still with us, and that is reason enough to worship. Why bother? because we constantly need to be drawn into the remembrance of God's care for us. I'd like to close this morning with a story that hopefully draws it all together and helps to answer the eternal question of why bother. There's a cathedral in England that features one whole wall made of glass. And in that glass are etched huge 4x10 figures of angels and saints having a party, blowing trumpets, dancing, making merry. And if that was the only thing that we saw when we walked into that cathedral, that glass wall, we might justifiably conclude that there's really something taunting, irrelevant, actually downright immoral about such fun going on in the heights of heaven when there's a host of us down here on earth suffering. We might look at that glass wall and everything that it depicts and ask, how could they construct such a thing when there's chronic and terminal illness that so many people are facing? Starvation is a reality for a third of the world. That there's stalking hatred by militia groups and terrorists. We might ask how they could display such a scene with all the meanness that we hear in political rhetoric these days. How they could possibly construct that wall when the economic picture shows us the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. We might look at that glass and wonder, what sort of God would throw a party like this in heaven, and what sort of church would have the nerve to display it? Here's the answer. That cathedral is located in Coventry, England, and that makes all the difference in the world. Because in November of 1940, Coventry, England, sustained the longest air raid and bombing of World War II. The entire city was destroyed. It was brought to rubble, including the cathedral in Coventry. It was an air raid that killed and destroyed the entire city. When the bombing attack was over, not one building was left standing in Coventry, England, including the old cathedral. When the parishioners built the new cathedral, they chose as the purpose of its ministry the theme of resurrection through sacrifice. So to look through the modern glass wall, beyond all the saints and the angels dancing in heaven, is to see the painful ruins of the old bombed-out church. The rubble of those ruins that symbolize life in this time and place cannot be seen through that glass wall except in the light of the promise of what the future holds. So when we worship, we do so with a brief glimpse into the promise of our future. We look through the glass wall and see the rubble of our lives today, but we can't see that rubble unless we're looking through the party that's going to be in heaven. That's why we bother with it. Because the resurrection stands front and center in our worship here. We find ourselves preparing for the ultimate worship service that is to come. In worship, we join with all who hear and respond to the call of God. We celebrate the redemption we have in Jesus Christ, and we rest in the arms of the one who will care for us forever. I think that's exactly why we bother to worship.